Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for tuning in this afternoon to this webinar presented by Christian Home Educators of Colorado and HSLDA, Homeschool Legal Defense Association. We are delighted that you have chosen to join us this afternoon and are looking forward to answering a lot of the questions that we have seen come up over the last week to 2 weeks regarding this new legislation impacting government-funded homeschool enrichment program. So we look forward to an informative and helpful, productive time together. We look forward to answering lots of questions. Just a little bit of a roadmap as far as where we're going to go over the next little while together. We are going to kind of just talk about sort of what happened with the new legislation, when it came about, how it came about. We're going to talk about what has changed in the law, and also we're going to jump into some Q&A. And toward that end, I wanted to invite everyone. We've already got some questions that we've been receiving that we want to address. But in addition to that, there's an opportunity for you all to submit questions, and we would ask you to do that in the Q&A window. You should see at the bottom of your screen a little Q&A box. Please don't use the chat window for the Q&A for questions. Please put those in the Q&A screen that you can see at the bottom of your screen there. Pop that open, and we'll try to do our best to work through the questions there. So we'll also kind of try to give some context around and considerations around government-funded enrichment programs and how to think about those. I know there's a variety of questions people have asked, and we'd like to address some of those. So to kick us off, I want to just start with some brief introductions. We are super excited to have Kevin Bowden, HSLDA attorney, on with us. Thank you, Kevin, for joining us this afternoon.
Yeah, good to be here, Steve. Thanks for having me.
In addition, we have our very own Government Relations Director, Colleen Enos, who has been working hard up at the Capitol, keeping an eye on things. And so, Colleen, thanks for joining this discussion as well this afternoon.
You bet. Wouldn't miss it.
All right. Well, we are going to just dive right in. And Colleen, for starters, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know a lot of people are kind of wondering sort of what happened, what went down. This kind of seemed last minute. So kind of give us a little bit of a quick recap of what happened with this piece of legislation.
Yeah, sure. I would love to explain that. So the bill that we're talking about that was passed is the School Finance Act. The School Finance Act, also known as SB 26-023, has to start either in the Senate or the House, one of the chambers, and be introduced. This year, it was introduced in the Senate, and it's important for you to know that the School Finance Act does in fact fund all schools in the state of Colorado. So it was introduced in the Senate, and it actually passed through the Senate, through the committee and the second reading and third reading on April 29th. And there were no amendments at all that affected part-time homeschool enrichment programs. So it was passed over to the House on about April 29th, April 30th, and it was assigned to the House Education Committee. So the School Finance Act passed out of the House Education Committee without any amendments affecting part-time homeschool enrichment programs. So it was unamended, and it was sent to the Appropriations Committee because it is a finance bill. In the Appropriations Committee, it was heard on Monday, May 11th. And you might be thinking, wow, that's really close to the end of the session. And you would be right. The session ended on the 13th, and this was Monday, May 11th. So it went to the House Appropriations Committee that morning, and during the Appropriations Committee, an amendment was not given affecting part-time homeschool enrichment programs. So it went on. It had other amendments added, but not the one affecting part-time homeschool enrichment. So it passed out of the Appropriations Committee that Monday, May 11th, without that amendment. So also the committee hearing phase is when people can offer testimony and give their opinions either for or against bills. So when it passed out of the Appropriations Committee, that that phase ended. So it went on the same day, May 11th, to be offered on the House floor for second reading. At that time, so just remember, you can't have any public testimony during that time. It was offered on the House floor for second reading, and that is when this amendment dealing with publicly funded part-time homeschool enrichment programs was added. So it went on to pass the House on second reading that day. And the next day, it was heard on third reading and it passed the House completely. And then it had to be sent back over to the Senate to accept those amendments and repass the bill. And that was on the 13th of May. And after they repassed the bill, did some other things, the session was adjourned and closed. So it's over. So the School Finance Act actually is mandated to pass by the end of the session so that all schools in the state of Colorado will be funded for the following fall. So it's passed, and it's before the governor right now for his signature.
Thank you, Colleen. So do I understand correctly that really when the amendment was inserted, it was after the public testimony phase, which is when typically people would, get involved in testifying at the various appropriate committees?
Yep, that's correct.
And it's also, do I understand correctly, it's part of a very large School Finance Act.
Right.
And it's just a piece of that. Now, does the governor have the authority to veto like line items within a piece of legislation, or is it just the entire thing? You veto or you don't veto it?
Yeah, he does not have that authority. And because the school finance bill is mandated to pass so that all the schools can be funded, there's really no way that he would ever veto a bill like that. It's a pretty
Sure.
massive bill. This was an amendment in the bill, but it funds all the schools. So it's passed.
Can I ask Colleen too, just I know some people are wondering like what was the reason, what was the motive of inserting this, and what was the main thing that you believe the legislators were trying to accomplish with this legislation?
So, in my opinion, I think that the Joint Budget Committee was trying to put guardrails around the part-time homeschool enrichment programs because it had grown so fast and had started costing the state a lot of money that they wanted to put guardrails on that. And because it was a finance bill, they waited until the very, very end of the session so that they would not get that public pushback. I think that was a pretty calculated move to wait to the end of the session, but I think that was their motivation.
Do you think that was a desire to actually like go after the homeschool law in some way specifically, or is this really just focused at how these, part-time government funded enrichment programs operate?
No, I don't think there was a desire at all to go after the homeschool law at all. They were very focused on the publicly funded part-time homeschool enrichment programs that had kind of ballooned through several of the programs, several of the BOCES programs.
Mm.
One in particular grew quite large, and they were concerned there was a loophole that they wanted to close down. And that was their motivation.
Thank you. Thanks, Colleen. Really appreciate that. Kevin, going to turn it over to you here to kind of just give us a little bit of the insight into what has actually changed in the law, and how that is going to apply specifically to the families on this webinar. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Again, my name is Kevin Bowden. I work with the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. We operate across the nation, have a great partnership with CHEC, and working with them to preserve and advance homeschool freedom there in the wonderful state of Colorado. I don't live there currently, but I did do a 2-year tour at Peterson I think it's now Peterson Space Force Base. So I lived on the Front Range there, just east of Colorado Springs for a couple of years. Loved the Colorado sunshine that everybody talks about, and it is fairly infamous for. And so it's good to be with you all. I'll highlight one thing Colleen said. This was a last minute thing in the legislature. And what I can say is there have been several states across the country where we have seen last minute additions that are negative post public comment period, post public testimony period. Probably the most notable example was taking up a bill at 11:15 on a Saturday night, the final day of the legislative session when it closed at 11:59 in the state where I live in West Virginia. So what has happened here in Colorado, we have seen a little bit of an increase of when it comes to homeschool legislation. Perhaps it's a testament to the power of the homeschool community that pays attention and that cares enough to show up. So what happened in Colorado, unfortunately, is not the only state that this is going on. So let me touch briefly on what this law does and what it doesn't do. I've seen a lot of the questions in the chat. We'll certainly get to those. There is the underlying question of the NOI and the independent school and how do we reconcile these. But the first thing I just want to say is, this law does nothing to change either the statute that deals with notices of intent, nor the underlying statute or provisions or regulations that deal with independent or parochial schools. So there is no change to how they operate, what they do, what they're required to do, what they're required to report, what they are required to collect or not collect. There's no changes to a family who files a notice of intent in terms of what they have to file, where they file it, or even what public school access looks like in terms of a sports team, spring baseball or a fall sport. So all of those are effectively unchanged. So Colleen's point and reiteration that this is a school finance bill, you should keep that at the forefront of mind when you're thinking about it. What the state appears to be doing is addressing a budgetary problem. And they looked at the budget, and it seems to me they said, hey, we think we can save some substantial money by reining in their mind these part-time homeschool enrichment programs. If you want kind of a summary of it, I would encourage you to look at the fiscal note. Not everybody looks at the fiscal note on the state legislature site, but they do have to summarize the bill in a pretty succinct, kind of understandable form. And that gives you a sense of what they're looking at. But the bottom line is it's a school finance bill, and they anticipate that this will save the state money overall when they look at the out years in terms of the school years. So they think this will meet their goal, which is to create a solution to the budget shortfall. And so they looked at different ways to do it, apparently. But what they landed on is effectively you cannot satisfy your compulsory education in an independent school and enroll in a part-time enrichment program. And the way that they are verifying this is by requiring a notice of intent when you go to enroll in the program. So if you go to enroll in whatever enrichment program you're a part of, they're going to say, cool, you can enroll. Here's what we need. We need your NOI. If you don't have an NOI, then you obviously will presumably not be approved for the program because you can't satisfy the requirement that you have to comply with in order to participate. So for most of you, that's one of the substantial changes. So if you're enrolled in CHEC, you might ask, well, what do I do now? And we'll get to that question here in a minute. And then the onus is on the enrichment program not to enroll kids who satisfy compulsory attendance in an independent or parochial school. So I think of this as a burden. If you're familiar at all with legal jargon, the burden is on the school not to enroll children who satisfy compulsory education through that means. And I think that's important, and it's a little bit nuanced, but I'm happy to have that discussion for those of you that want to address that nuance. So that's the first thing, is you want to participate in the part-time enrichment program. You have to verify your eligibility by providing the notice of intent. And we're not going to get into how you provide a notice of intent and what the requirements are, where you can file it. Shameless plug, if you want to go to the HSLDA website, we lay it out pretty clearly on what the requirements there are. The other thing that it did majorly, and almost seemed to me when you read the bill to be more of a reason for the bill, was to rein in where part-time enrichment programs can operate. So there are a couple of, as Colleen mentioned, there are a couple of big ones, or at least one very large one. And one of the ways that they think that they'll cut funding is by requiring that, limiting where that part-time enrichment program can operate. Instead of giving this kind of statewide permission, they'll cut funding by saying you can't operate just wherever. You have to operate within the districts. And so again, they hope that will cut enrollment. I don't know that the notice of intent requirement for verification is really tied to cutting the funding. It seems to me that most of that is going to become by reducing who's actually eligible. Because theoretically, if you don't change the second part of this, everybody could file a notice of intent. You can file the notice anywhere in the state. So it may do very little from a public funding perspective. So at the end of the day, the takeaway is this is a school finance bill. They're addressing financial concerns and challenges that the state is facing. There's no underlying change from my perspective in a family's fundamental right to homeschool or what they have to do or what they have to comply with or what they have to teach, either in an NOI or in an independent school. And the goal here is to reduce the funding, the output of the state for these programs. And they do honestly think that it will achieve the objective. They anticipate substantial, in the millions of dollars of savings, I think in the second out year in terms of school years, 27, 28 maybe, $30+ million in overall savings from the bill itself. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of it. And obviously there are some repetitive questions, so we can look at those. But some people have asked, people reached out to HSLDA, the members that we have, and have asked, hey, doesn't this threaten homeschool freedom? Our position honestly is I don't think it does. I don't think this threatens a parent's fundamental natural right to homeschool their child. It does place a constraint or eligibility on a family who wants to participate in a publicly funded enrichment program. And you can enroll in those if you want, but it seems to me that the state may it seems to me that it's good for them to look at how not to have a budget shortfall and to come up with some ways that they think they can address that. We can debate whether they've done the right thing or whether this is the right solution or whether, as Colleen mentioned, perhaps the methodology of post-public comment is the right manner in which to do it. But trying to address the budget shortfall makes sense. And there's lots of things that when folks enroll in a public school for any program, there's often paperwork that accompanies that to determine eligibility. There's some risk the school is taking. So looking at it holistically, you may not share my opinion, but I don't think your fundamental right to homeschool is changed in Colorado. But I do think it places guardrails around these part-time enrichment programs, which are very popular. When we lived there, we knew many, many families who participated in them. They loved them. Their kids loved them. So this is not a commentary on whether the programs are good, bad, or otherwise, or whether the kids like them or don't like them. It's simply a commentary on what it does to the underlying fundamental right that a family has to choose to educate their child at home. So hopefully that's fairly clear. So with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Steve, for potentially some of these robust questions that are coming through the Q&A.
Thank you, Kevin. I just want to start off with just kind of piggybacking off of what you just said with kind of a follow-up question, because I think for some parents sitting there, they're hearing, well, I'm hearing this doesn't undermine my fundamental freedom as a homeschool parent, but yet when I want to go to one of these programs, now I have to do an NOI. And I may not, necessarily be able to do the independent school program. We're going to talk more about that later. So that feels like that was an undermining of my freedom there. Kind of how would you respond to that? Like in my experience, that feels like I lost freedom. But how do you reconcile that with, hey, this isn't a fundamental undermining of homeschool freedom?
Yeah, the way I would think about it, and I'll just use a personal example. We have a senior in high school this last year. He wanted to play soccer at the local high school. We have an equal access statute. And in order for him to do that, I had to provide information that I would not otherwise have had to provide to the public school. Things like his immunization history and a registration form, which I think was actually called an enrollment form, which scares homeschool families. Like, I don't want to fill out an enrollment form when I'm not enrolling the child in classes. And my perspective was, okay, I am choosing to cross over this threshold into this public sector publicly funded space and giving some authority to that school, right? I didn't pick where they practiced. I didn't pick the coaches of the team. I didn't pick the administrators that I had now had to interact with. And so when I crossed over that threshold, I didn't view that as a threat to my fundamental right to home educate. I can choose to participate in this program that is being funded by money that they've taken from my community and given to the school, or I can choose to not do it. And whether I choose to participate or choose not to participate, it doesn't have any bearing on the fundamental right that I have to do that or to homeschool. And so I have the same perspective of the enrichment program. It's an optional program. You may love it. You may think that it's integral to your homeschool journey. And maybe that's true. Maybe you think that really this has become such a part of who we are and what my kid wants to do that we have to do it. That's okay. You can have that perspective. But with that comes some requirements that you might have to deal with that if you did not exercise that option, you would not have to deal with. So that's just how I think about it. I didn't like submitting immunization records either to the school, but I also didn't bemoan them for asking. Now, I don't think they should ask anyways. I hate that I had to provide them. But what I didn't do is view it as a threat to my fundamental right to homeschool. I viewed it as a bit of offensive as a parent that I would have to do this thing, but not to the fundamental right that I think the Constitution and Supreme Court jurisprudence has routinely upheld throughout our nation's history. So that's how I personally deal with it.
Thank you, Kevin. That's a helpful clarification. And I think kind of what I'm hearing is because the additional restriction and legislation was actually put on a public school program, right? Not actually the homeschool law. And so, you're not going to be under that additional regulation, oversight, whatever, unless you choose to participate in that public school program. And there are all kinds of other restrictions and things that families interact with anytime they, again, kind of cross over into that government sphere of their programming. And this is just an additional requirement regulation that's now being added at this point in time, but it's not being added directly to homeschooling, the homeschool statute or independent school statute. So that's super helpful. I really appreciate that. Before we jump into kind of some of the meat of the Q&A here, I did want to, one of the questions that we have had is because CHEC operates in independent school and have for many years, and this is one of the options that families have really come to love and appreciate, and especially I think the additional freedoms that accompany that. What is CHEC planning to do with families who are maybe currently, have children enrolled in the CHEC independent school, but now might be filing notice of intent for children that they want to enroll in these enrichment programs? And I did want to say there's more to be said on this on later communication in the future, but we do plan to introduce a record-keeping service that will basically allow a non-enrollment option for students who they have filed a notice of intent for. And this will allow access to some of the same great services and benefits and kind of compliance help that you have received through the independent school just under a non-enrolled status. So again, more to be said on that later, but we do look forward to creative ways that we can continue to help families going forward, those who choose to continue with independent school, and those who may, as with students that are enrolled, but also maybe those who maybe want to keep some enrolled, but file a notice of intent with others. And I did want to just clarify too, and Kevin, you can just correct me if I'm wrong on this, but this is basically, don't look at it as like a per family kind of legislation. It's per student and what program they're in. So if I have, let's say, 5 kids and I have 2 of them enrolled in one of these programs, I'll have to submit a notice of intent for those 2 children. but perhaps I would want to keep the other three, right, enrolled in an independent school. That is something that I can do. It's not like you're in or you're out on an independent school on a family basis. Is that correct, Kevin?
Absolutely. Yeah, the bill deals in terms of students. So
Okay.
individual compulsory education aged children. And so,
Okay.
and actually, along that point, Steve, people may not know this, but there is a lot of movement in between different types of educational options. There's lots of families that have students who do one option versus ones that do the other. There's actually a lot that have some go to public school, some are homeschooled, some go to private school. It's actually pretty rare. Like I think less than 15% of students that are educated homeschooled K through 12 all the way through. So this type of movement in the educational sector is pretty common. And so absolutely, oftentimes Christian families think familial more so than legislation, which deals with kind of individual units and children, or students in this case. But yeah, the plain language of the law is students who satisfy compulsory attendance, not a family who has filed or enrolled or uses an independent school for some other for some other reason or for some other child. So yeah, it's very clear to make that distinction. It's probably not an all or nothing, take all or leave all dilemma that a family may feel that they're, now put in.
Got it. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Well, I think one of the biggest questions we've seen come through, and we'll just start with this question, Kevin, and I'll pitch this one over to you, is can I enroll in an independent homeschool umbrella school and enroll in a government-funded part-time homeschool enrichment program at the same time? Can I do both?
Yeah, can you enroll with an independent school and file the NOI and participate in the part-time program?
Yes.
Yeah, man, this is like the $1 million question, right? So I'll give my legal caveat before I answer any of these questions, which is, this should just be considered general information. If you want specific legal advice or specific commentary to your specific situation, reach out to us and let us know. What I can say is the statute does not appear, the school finance bill does not address this issue, in my opinion. It does talk about per pupil things and funding mechanisms and not double counting students from a state BOE perspective. That's how I read the bill. But it's important to note the school finance bill does not directly address this issue. The other thing I can say is I have had families or I have had districts tell me if they want to participate, they're going to have to file a notice of intent, even though that district knows they're already enrolled in an independent school. So I won't give you any more than that. I won't tell you which districts they're in or where they're located, but what I can tell you is I have had districts tell me that if a student wants to participate in this thing, they will have to file a notice of intent knowing that they're already in an independent school. So take that for what it's worth. And again, the other thing that's interesting in the language is this idea of satisfying compulsory attendance through the independent school. So it strikes me that perhaps one could envision a situation where a family is participating or a dues paying member in an independent school, but may not satisfy compulsory attendance for that student through that institution. Perhaps there's other services that they are receiving from that, but they're filing a notice of intent for purposes of compulsory education. We'd have to go into the compulsory education statute and the exceptions to public school. But I will make a note here, Steve, just so folks know, if you file your notice of intent, you can't just file this paperwork and act like it's a one and done and ignore the other statutory requirements. So I would not tell somebody, oh, all you're doing is filing a notice of intent so that you can enroll in the part-time enrichment program and you can ignore the other provisions of the law. That I would not say, just like I wouldn't say, well, you can enroll in an independent school, and if they have one policy you like, follow that. But if they have 5 policies you don't like, you can ignore those. It's like, no, you should find a different school that you want to work with, that represents your values, that wants to work with you, that you can partner with. So that's a bit of it's kind of a non-answer because I don't want to give a blanket answer for everybody. There are some districts that deal with this differently than other districts. There's nothing in the school finance bill itself that says that this is a per se prohibition. All we can look at right now is the plain language of the law, which is if you want to participate in the part-time enrichment program, then they will verify eligibility through filing a notice of intent. That's what we do know. That's what's clear from the plain language of the statute as passed.
Thanks, Kevin. I appreciate that. That's super helpful. There was a point of clarification too. Some people have asked, hey, what's the difference between an umbrella school and an independent school? They're kind of hearing these two different terms. And basically, I would just clarify to say that the independent or parochial school are the terms that are used in the law. The umbrella word is not used in the law, to my knowledge, but it is used by the homeschool community to describe these independent schools that are operating as sort of a legal umbrella to homeschool families that enroll with them but do their education at home. So the umbrella term is not a technical legal term. They're the same thing. An independent school is the same thing as an umbrella school in terms of how the homeschool community thinks about it. The technical term for them is, though, an independent school in terms of how the law refers to it. And then kind of piggybacking off of something Kevin was just getting into, which is super helpful. Colleen, this is kind of going to be over to you. And I think some people are wondering, okay, what's the big deal if I just, that I want to, put Johnny into this enrichment program. They want me to sign this NOI, this piece of paper. I signed the piece of paper. Is that all there is to it? I just signed the piece of paper and that's all.
So thank you
By
for the
piece of
question.
paper, I mean the NOI, the notice of intent.
The notice of intent. Thank you for the question, Steve. So it's not just a piece of paper as Kevin talked about. It's a notice of intent, and it's basically saying that you're going to follow the homeschool law, which means that you have to follow the law, including attendance, 172 days, that you have to follow the law, including the subjects you need to cover. You're doing evaluation / testing on those 3rd, 5th, 7th, 9th, 11th years. So there are requirements within the homeschool law that you have to follow, and your notice of intent is saying that that is in fact what you are doing. So it's not just a piece of paper. It represents you telling the district that you are in fact following the homeschool law. And so you need to do that. And there are certain things that you should put on that notice of intent. And there are things that you don't need to put on that notice of intent. And we would encourage you not to put more information on that notice of intent than you are required to do. And just like Kevin said, HSLDA has like specific here's the notice of intent requirements. You don't need to give them more than what they require. Frequently, when you do that, it leads to more and more and more information being requested, and we don't want that. None of us want that. So only put on the notice of intent what they require to be on the notice of intent.
Yeah, thank you, Colleen. And I think just to break that down a little bit too, so if you go into one of these programs, they might give you a notice of intent form that might ask a lot more questions than you're legally required to give by law. So if you go to CHEC.org, you can search notice of intent. You'll get a little sample form that is a notice of intent that is exactly what's required in the law, or you can get that from HSLDA as well. But just know that if you go to the program or to the district website, they might provide you with a notice of intent that asks for a lot more information. So we would just encourage families to be aware of that and to only provide the information that they're required to by law. And one of the other things, I think some people are wondering, what do I lose? What's the difference between filing an NOI or being under the umbrella of an independent school? And many families that are in independent schools are already aware of those benefits. But one of the things that does happen, for example, is there's some additional tracking of attendance with respect to hours that you should be mindful of. Also, there is the testing requirement, and there is the requirement that those test results be submitted to the district where you filed your notice with. So that's another big one that you should just one that stands out in my mind because you might be used to either not submitting a test at all, or you might be used to submitting that test to, annually to the independent school where you have your children enrolled. But if you file a notice of intent, you will need to submit that test result to the district where you filed your notice, unless you have made a note at the bottom of the notice of intent that you will be holding those test results with an independent school. And so that is another kind of question we can deal with more later in the future, another privacy mechanism. But that testing requirement is something you'll need to be aware of if you choose to file that notice of intent. So super helpful. Thank you, Colleen. Appreciate that. So so just kind of to circle back then, Kevin, and kind of back over to you. Does this new regulation in any way impact umbrella school students or homeschool students, even NOI students that aren't participating in enrichment, government-funded enrichment programs?
Does it change anything for them?
Yes.
No.
Okay.
No, if you're not participating in a part-time enrichment program, this school finance bill has no bearing on what you do or what you have been doing. It will continue as usual.
And then what about some of the other areas of like interaction with the school district, or maybe even community colleges? Does this change any of, like, Johnny playing sports with the local school, or access to dual enrollment programs at community colleges?
No, not to my knowledge. Colorado has a fairly, I would say, not even easy to understand process and set of laws that you've got to go through in terms of, public access. But no, this gets back to the earlier point, Steve, which is the underlying fundamental actual right that you have to homeschool it is unchanged. If your kid wants to play soccer or run track, you're going to go through the same process, and that's not without complication either. You want to talk about paperwork and dealing with districts and principals and where your kids plays versus how they're treated, and you want them to play for this high school, but they got assigned to this other one. That's not exactly a cakewalk for many families either, as perhaps some on the call here can attest to. But the bottom line is the School Finance Act doesn't change any of that. It remains unchanged as it was before.
Very good. I think I want to jump into now what might be a little bit of the elephant in the room to some folks. I know we got some questions. I know HSLDA did as well, just as far as like, how did this happen? What did we do to oppose this legislation? What are we doing to kind of like, if this passes, which it has passed, what are we planning to do about it? Sort of all those questions. And one thing that I want to be very clear about at this point in a webinar is that even though, as Colleen talked about, the timeline of this legislation being introduced was post-public testimony, it was the very last minute, we were fully aware of this legislation once it was introduced. And we got on the phone with Kevin, and we talked about on Tuesday, right before the legislature closed, what are we going to do with this? Because even though, like, from man's point of view, like, it was too late, there's nothing that could be done. Like, absolutely, if there had been a direct threat to our fundamental homeschool freedom, we absolutely would have done something about it, no matter if it was the midnight hour or not. And so this definitely wasn't something that like snuck by. We were well aware of it. There wasn't a lot of time to consider what to do about it and to do something about it. But we did catch it, and there was time, and we did have a meaningful discussion about how do we approach this legislation in a way that is, protective of the fundamental freedoms that we are trying to defend. And so sort of this question of, why didn't CHEC and HSLDA oppose it? I think, Kevin, you touched on this earlier, and I'd like to hear, you opine on it a bit more. in a few minutes. But one of the things that I wanted to say is that the way that we look at homeschool freedom is that private funded home education is this island of freedom, we like to say. And that is the island that for over 30 years, CHEC has been defending private funded home education. And when we look at this legislation, we saw that this was actually a restriction not being placed on privately funded home education. It was an additional restriction put on a government school program. And we know that there's lots of restrictions and rules and stuff that they put on these programs. Those are not the things that CHEC is defending against or interacting and opposing. We are specifically trying to defend this island of homeschool freedom. And when you, so that is how we think about it at CHEC. Like, is this an attack on our fundamental core freedom to homeschool, on the homeschool statute, even on an independent school statute that allows for some additional flexibilities? No, it wasn't. It was a restriction, legislation targeting a government school program. And that's exactly what these are. These are public school programs. They're not homeschool programs. They are part-time government school programs. And so that is the decision that we made. In fact, I would say would even be a temptation to sort of create some kind of a carve out, because this could mean that some families may not enroll in an independent school and choose to file an NOI instead, and that's fine, and that may affect the way that we're able to engage with and support some families. But we don't want to make policy decisions around what might protect our independent school or whatever. We want to stay true to our principles, and that is we are defending privately funded home education. And there is a real risk. There would be a real risk potential risk in trying to create even some kind of a carve out. I mean, we talked about this some, Kevin, it all went down quickly. But for example, in my mind, even if we were to say, hey, we want to carve out for independent schools because, hey, there's these homeschoolers and they don't want to file a notice of intent. They want to stay in these independent schools. There's a real risk that we would be opening independent schools up to additional legislation, additional scrutiny to say, hey, that's great. We understand even if there was a legislator that wanted to play ball in that way, they would say, but we would need to verify in some way that you are kind of what you say you are and all of these things, right? And so there's just like no telling what kind of additional like oversight scrutiny you could potentially be opening independent schools up to, even if we were to get some kind of carve out legislatively speaking for independent schools who are not brick and mortar, but they only service homeschool families. So Kevin, I'd love to hear you jump in on that a little bit more, but just kind of talk about sort of, how you approach this. I mean, I know you addressed it earlier, but kind of how HSLDA thinks about this in terms of a homeschool freedom issue.
Yeah, we look at, people use the word rights in a variety of contexts, right? I have a right to do this. I have a right to do that. Sometimes it's very narrow. I have a right to enroll my child in a public school program without having to do X, Y, or Z. We are really looking at the fundamental right of a parent to choose to home educate their children. What we would hope for is without, undue government regulation or oversight. And so, like CHEC, we have a position on the public funding of private home education, which is not unknown. This goes back 8 years when Jim Mason, our current president, penned an article called The Civic Virtue of Private Home Education. It was about ESAs, of which enrichment programs are a form of taxpayer-funded services that are provided to an individual family. And so these comes in all shapes of sizes. But our position on this has been clear, which, we think that privately funded private home education, the way it has been probably more traditionally thought of, is right and good. And we stand ready to, preserve and defend that against whatever risks may come. And this era that we're in of public funding of different institutions or different programs that people participate in. I don't have I mean, Colorado needs to decide what Colorado is going to do with the taxpayers' funds that they collect from the people that live in that state. And I think they have a fiduciary duty to handle those funds responsibly and with certain oversight. But I don't think, a family being required, for example, to file an NOI in order to verify eligibility is a violation of a constitutional right for any family in the state. And you may disagree with that. And I've gotten some emails of people that have a very different opinion from me. And that's okay. We've been dealing with this issue a long time. I think the track record of HSLDA and the track record of CHEC speaks for itself in terms of what we're committed to and what we're not committed to. So if you think that CHEC and HSLDA is somehow has a change in philosophy or perspective, or we're principally not following what our core mission or values are, I would just encourage you to look at what our history has demonstrated. And the other thing that I'll say is, I think it's important in these sometimes emotionally charged debates to just remain as united as you can and remember all the issues for which we are aligned as a community. You might think that enrichment programs are the best thing ever and they've done wonders for your children, and that may be true. And you may think that enrichment programs are a highway towards government regulation of homeschooling and, the elimination of your right to homeschool. But what you probably both agree on is that homeschooling is good and that the rights of parents to do this should remain protected from a constitutional perspective. And that which aligns you with your neighbor is probably much greater and stronger than that which may divide you on this particular issue. So if you've been with CHEC, I would encourage you to find ways to ensure that organizations like CHEC remain, because that is an island that's worth fighting for. And if you're enrolled in an independent school and you've never filed a notice of intent in your life, then I hope you would care that the people who do file an NOI are on your team, and you should have a vested interest in that little island of freedom as well. And so let's not just care about the pond we're swimming in, but let's have an interest in the ponds that other families that are like-minded are also utilizing. So stand on your principle. Recognize that people may have a difference of opinion. It doesn't mean they're evil. It doesn't mean that they're sold out to something else. It doesn't mean that they're asleep at the wheel. They may just have a fundamentally different view on this particular issue. And frankly, in the republic that we live in, that's okay. And that's quite all right. It doesn't mean we should be uncivil towards each other. It just means we should recognize that we have a disagreement. We should look at that person's history, judge their character. And as brothers and sisters in the Lord, we should treat them accordingly, with the respect and honor that we would accord any human being. So I think those principles are important, and sometimes they can get lost when there's high energy and high emotion that's at stake. So I would welcome anyone to reach out to us if you want to talk to me. We can discuss this type of issue for a long time, but principally we have a viewpoint that we're held to, and we have resources that the Lord has given us. CHEC has resources the Lord has given them to do the mission that they have been called to do. And our mission is not really to defend every family who wants taxpayer dollars to be able to get that with, the minimal amount of oversight. If there's another organization that's committed to that, then they should do whatever they've been called to, but we don't feel like it's our mission. And so we're going to use the resources that we've been given to really be faithful to that mission and those principles that we have. So I can get to some of these questions in the chat, Steve, if you want. I know we're running a little bit low on time, but.
Yeah. Let's take about 3 minutes here, Kevin. You can jump into a few of those, and then I've got some kind of closing remarks I'd like to make at the end.
Okay. So I'm going to go just some of that I've seen scrolling through. There's too many to respond to individually as I type them all out. But I don't have any information about how many students these programs will accept. Some of that's just going to play out. But there's been no change to the notice of intent law. So right now you can file your notice of intent with any district. There's no reason to think that is different. In terms of whether you have to participate in the district that the enrichment program is in, I think there'll be some guidance on that. As we've mentioned, it doesn't affect public school programs. And one of the reasons for the, let me finish the thought, Colleen, and then I'll get to you. One of the reasons for the law was to deal with what the legislature thought was programs and things that were not part of a traditional public school curriculum. So they singled out things like ski passes, for example. And so when somebody put a note in here about music, drama, sports, those are things that traditionally have been offered. And so those things are in a different category than what they're trying to address, which is these, what they at least view to be really off the wall, outside the bounds of what public education should be. And because it's outside the bounds of what public education should be, it should not be funded with public education dollars, which is what is being used to fund them. So a fundamental view of how they're looking at why they're looking at certain programs and not others. So that doesn't get to a lot of things that are out here, but those are a couple of questions I saw pop up. So go ahead, Colleen.
So yeah, just to jump in on that, where to file your notice of intent. In listening to the State Board of Education's meeting recently from a week and a half ago, I think they are wanting you to file your notice of intent with the district that you're going to do your part-time enrichment program in. So wherever that is, wherever that part-time enrichment program is, I think they want you to file your notice of intent with the district that program is affiliated with. In their conversation, I think they're pretty clear about that.
Yeah, I have no doubts that that's what they want you to do. The question is whether they can legally mandate it. And if you have filed in a different county or different district and you're enrolling in a part-time program over here, can they not accept that NOI as valid for verification purposes? That's the question. I'm not reading anything that would say, at least I haven't read anything yet that would lead me to think that they can validly say it's not acceptable, even if it may not be their preferred method. So I'm not familiar with private enrichment programs. So if there's a private pay option, whether the NOI requirement applies, I'm just not familiar enough to do that. I don't know what the long-term play is on the BOCES program, whether this is a first step towards trying to eliminate these altogether. I don't know why they're limiting it to district of enrollment, the BOCES programs, unless they're trying to do with the budget. Will it lead to a restriction on where you can file your NOI? I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. I don't know why they have that law in the first place, or what the rationale was, or whether they've considered it behind closed doors to change that. So there's a lot of questions that we can speculate on why they're doing what they're doing, but really what we know is what's written in the black letter law that was just passed and what exists in other statute and regulation. And that's what we have to go off of, along with, at least for those of us that deal with this, what we're seeing in practice, which is not always uniform across the districts. So anyways, I'll close it there, Steve, and turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Kevin. Appreciate that. Reach back out to us or HSLDA as well. I know there's additional kind of specific questions we just weren't able to get to today, but we welcome those additional questions either to the office here at CHEC, or I know HSLDA is standing by to answer questions as well for their members. I did just kind of want to take a moment of personal privilege, as they say sometimes in the legislature, here at the end, to just speak briefly from my heart. One of the things that I've seen, as we've seen various questions and people interacting with this issue, is just, I would say, a fair amount of fear and concern about, like, how is this going to impact me? How is this going to impact my children? What if I were to lose these programs? And I get that. I want to just provide some context here for those that are on the meeting, and maybe especially for those that are newer to the homeschool community. Some of you know that I was homeschooled myself in the late 80s and 90s, and very grateful for my homeschool upbringing. And during that time, these government-funded enrichment programs didn't exist, or mostly didn't exist. And yet, homeschooling thrived for decades, the modern homeschool movement, and our family thrived. And sort of like, how did we get by? How did my parents get by without those? Well, I would say number one, my parents were people of faith who trusted that the Lord would provide, right, ultimately for the needs of their children. And they were taking an intentional step away from a government institution, and they were taking back educational independence. And so that was something they did very thoughtfully and intentionally. And so, yes, that meant that they had to, provide different experiences privately. And it was just neat reflecting over my childhood. And this was actually, before even a lot of the wonderful private enrichment programs that exist today existed. We had all kinds of experiences, though, as homeschool students. I think about just various hands-on experiences that my dad found for us boys working with a man in the church or something to learn some kind of skill. There were all kinds of experiences we had through a season of ministry together as a family. God faithfully provided so many incredible experiences through my homeschool experience. And I would say that ultimately, as I said before, my parents stepped forward in faith and God rewarded that faith. And that's what I would say to any parent out there, that as you step forward in faith to take back independence in the area of education for your children, God will reward that faith. And I know that for myself today, as I kind of move forward to the current moment that we're in, I mean, we have a large family, we have 8 children, and here we are trying to, privately fund their education. And I think I wrestle with, and my wife does the same thing many of you do, that, hey, we don't want our children to miss out on anything. We want to do right by them. And but ultimately it comes back to this question of faith, that we are trusting the Lord to provide what our children need, and also to be creative and to look for the opportunities around us that are free, that do present themselves. For example, my brother bought a home to remodel and sell earlier this year, and my son got to get some great hands-on construction experience helping with that project. Our church does a wonderful ministry outreach choir, and a number of my children get to participate in that. And so there's just so many private experiences out there. Add to that all of the wonderful enrichment, privately funded enrichment programs you can find on the CHEC Homeschool Group directory. There are so many opportunities out there for us as families. So I just want to commend that to you. And I do just want to just exhort the whole community to education independence. Homeschooling traditionally, foundationally, was a movement towards freedom and and independence in the area of education. And it was really a generation of parents who said, we want to take back the rights and responsibilities to educate our children. And we want to take that back from the government, right? And so, and the homeschool movement thrived under that. My family thrived under that. And a big part of the reason why the homeschool statute that was passed back in 1988, specifically talking about home-based education programs, says that they are not under the control and supervision of the district, is because they're not funded by the district. And so there is a connection between the control and the funding. What we've always said is what the government funds, the government controls. It's sort of like a law of nature, more or less. And so government funded part-time programs are still public school programs, and they represent a step back under government control. And I know we can have lots of lively discussions about, well, should you use those programs and should you not use those programs? And don't my tax dollars help to fund the programs? And why should I not use them if they do? All kinds of questions that we could have, obviously outside of the scope of what we have just a few minutes left here. But what I did want to answer sort of a different question, and that is how to think about this maybe from a biblical perspective. In 1 Corinthians 7:21 and 23, Paul, speaking to slaves specifically, he says, were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. You were bought with a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. And so obviously, Paul's addressing a very specific situation there, but the bigger principle is, if you can be free, be free. And that's what I want to say to all of you today. If you can be free, be free. Homeschooling education is an independence where we make choices. And so if you can make a choice towards independence, then I encourage you to do that. We consider also the moment that we're in closing. I think all of us as Americans, as we approach the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, our hearts are beating a little bit more rapidly with the principles of freedom, right? And independence. And we see the things on social media and the flags flying and the different ways that we're commemorating our nation's birth. But as we enter that season, we're actually coming into what I've heard from Mike Ferris, founder of HSLDA, said recently in a letter that HSLDA is seeing some of the worst attacks on homeschooling that they've seen in 20 years. That is the moment that we're at. Things are not getting better in terms of freedom for homeschooling. And so this is a moment to be, I think, very careful. This is a moment to think very seriously about the choices that we make. Because remember, it doesn't just affect our children and their experiences that they have. It affects their children and their children. What kind of homeschool freedom do you want to hand over to your children, to your grandchildren? That will in some way be shaped by the decisions and choices that you make today. And I would just say that the more that the homeschool community endeavors to build connections to government funding, the more difficult it is to preserve this island of freedom that we call private home education. So I think of and just in closing, the final words of Patrick Henry from his famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. He says, "What is it that gentlemen wish? What would they have? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death." And I know the fight that they were fighting feels very different from what we experience today, but it's very easy for us to slowly sacrifice our liberties at the altar of opportunities and money. And so let's just consider those choices that we're making and the freedoms that we'll hand over to our children and to our grandchildren. So in closing, I just want to thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate you and all the work that you've done this last legislative session. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us and all of your insight. We are so grateful for the work of HSLDA over the decades, standing behind homeschool freedom really around the world. It's just a remarkable work that the good folks at Homeschool Legal Defense Association do. I strongly encourage every family out there, if you're not a member, become a member today. They are such a great help and such a great organization to support and get behind it. Listen, if you care about homeschool freedom for the future of your children, grandchildren, go and become an HSLDA member today. I would encourage you. So God bless you all, and thanks for tuning in today.